In the humid spring of 1862, along a forgotten trace in Ouachita Parish, Louisiana, a roadside rest stop waited for the war to send it customers. It was called Cypress Crossings, a name that promised shelter but offered something far more permanent. Travelers, displaced by the conflict tearing the nation apart, would arrive seeking a hot meal and a safe bed, only to find themselves part of the wet, dark soil. The proprietor would smile, his sister would offer a bowl of rich stew, and the bayou would swallow the evidence. This place was not merely a casualty of wartime lawlessness. It was a carefully designed abattoir, a quiet graveyard disguised as a sanctuary on a road no one thought to watch. If you are drawn to the shadows where history hides its darkest truths, and this is the first time you have found this archive, consider subscribing to ensure you do not miss the unearthing of what has been so long buried. The Trace Road itself was an artery of necessity, a muddy vein branching from the more reliable river road that followed the Ouachita between Monroe and the dense pine hills to the west. It was a path for those in a hurry, or for those who wished to avoid the scrutiny that travel along the main waterway invited. In the year 1862, such travelers were numerous and varied. The war in the West was a churning, unpredictable beast, and its effects rippled through the Louisiana backwoods, creating a constant flow of human traffic. Cypress Crossings stood a long mile from the main river thoroughfare, positioned perfectly to catch this desperate and unwatched tide. To find it, one had to know to look for the trio of lightning-split cypress trees that marked the turnoff, a landmark that felt less like a guidepost and more like a warning. The inn was a long, low building of dark, weathered cypress planks, its wide gallery supported by columns of unstripped logs that seemed to have grown right out of the damp earth. The entire structure sagged slightly, as if burdened by the oppressive weight of the humidity and the secrets it held within its walls. Spanish moss, thick as a grieving widow's veil, hung from the colossal cypress and water oaks that crowded the property, muffling sound and dripping a perpetual, clammy dew onto the packed earth yard. The air was thick, a soupy mixture of wood smoke, mud, and the sweet, cloying scent of swamp decay. 2 lanterns, kept lit from dusk until dawn, glowed with a greasy, yellow light through the skeins of moss, beacons that promised warmth and respite but instead seemed like the unblinking eyes of some patient, watchful creature. Behind the main building, the ground sloped away into a brackish backwater of Bayou Masson, a place where the drone of frogs and the ceaseless hum of insects formed a thick, monotonous blanket of sound, a permanent feature of the landscape that could swallow a scream without a single ripple in its rhythm. The proprietors of this isolated establishment were a brother and sister, Eustace and Corinne Bellamy. Eustace was the public face of Cypress Crossings. He was a man of middling height, with a frame that was deceptively slender, hiding a wiry strength. His dark hair was meticulously combed, and his clothes, though simple, were always clean and pressed, an oddity in this muddy, chaotic corner of the world. He met every arriving stagecoach and every lone rider with a placid, welcoming smile, his voice a low, soothing baritone that spoke of safety and comfort. He moved with an unhurried grace, his hands steady as he took the reins of a tired horse or offered a dipper of cool cistern water to a weary traveler. His one small, humanizing habit was a meticulous attention to the whittling of small, intricate birds from scraps of cypress wood. He would sit on the gallery in the evenings, his knife moving with a surgeon's precision, producing tiny, perfect effigies of wrens and sparrows that he would line up on the railing, only to sweep them into the fire before retiring for the night. It was as if he could create perfection but could not bear to let it exist. Corinne was his shadow, a presence felt more than seen. She was taller than her brother, with a severe posture that made her seem almost spectral as she moved through the dim corridors of the inn. Her domain was the interior, the guest rooms, the kitchen, the dining hall. She ensured the linens were clean, the floors swept, and the meals served on time. She rarely spoke, communicating her needs to the cook, Aunt Zora, with a series of quiet gestures and pointed looks. Her face was pale and impassive, a mask that betrayed nothing of the thoughts that moved behind her dark, watchful eyes. Travelers might catch a glimpse of her adjusting a curtain or placing a fresh candle on a table, her movements silent and efficient. She was the architect of the inn's domestic tranquility, a tranquility that felt brittle and thin, as if it could shatter at the slightest touch. Together, the Bellamys presented a front of courteous, almost pious, respectability, an island of civilization in a world upended by war. That world was a desperate one. The Union blockade of southern ports had tightened its grip, and the interior waterways were becoming increasingly contested. Federal gunboats patrolled the Mississippi, pushing trade and traffic onto smaller rivers and forgotten roads like the one that passed the Bellamys' door. The Ouachita was a lifeline, but a dangerous one. Regular Confederate troop movements were common, with columns of gray-clad soldiers marching toward the strategic hub of Vicksburg, their faces grim with the knowledge of the battles to come. But for every official column, there were dozens of unofficial travelers, deserters from both armies, men broken by the horrors of Shiloh or Island Number 10, sought to lose themselves in the anonymous swamps. Refugees, their homes burned or occupied, clogged the roads, carrying their few remaining possessions, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. And then there were the opportunists, the contraband traders, men like Hiram Thatch, who drove his stage on a flexible schedule, and his cargo, as often undeclared medical supplies or bolts of cloth as it was paying passengers. In this environment, the law was a distant concept. The local constable in Monroe had his hands full with troubles in the town itself. The remote parishes were left to fend for themselves. A man could disappear out here, and it would be months before anyone thought to ask what had become of him. He could have been taken by river pirates, conscripted into a passing unit, or simply succumbed to one of the many fevers that bred in the stagnant waters of the bayou. Rumor was the only currency of information, and it was a coin that was easily debased. The air was thick, not just with humidity, but with paranoia and suspicion. Every stranger was a potential threat. Every shadow could hide a bushwhacker. It was a perfect hunting ground for any predator that knew how to be patient. The locals, the scattered families who scratched a living from the thin soil between the swamp and the pine hills, kept their distance from cypress crossings. They traded for goods at the ferry landing, a few miles downriver, a transaction point presided over by the grizzled and taciturn ferryman, Obed Raines. Obed had seen the Bellamys arrive 2 years prior, just as the secession crisis was boiling over. They had purchased the old trading post with cash, gold coin that was already becoming scarce, and had quickly transformed it into an inn. He knew the rhythms of the river and the road, and he noticed things. He noticed, for instance, that while Hiram Thatch's stagecoach often dropped off passengers at the crossings, it rarely seemed to pick any up on its return journey. When he mentioned this to Hiram, the stage driver would just shake his head, his face clouded with a weary unease. Hiram told him that the Bellamys always had a plausible explanation. The passenger had decided to stay on for a few more days of rest, or had hired a private guide to take them overland toward Texas, or had paid for passage on a skiff heading south. The stories were always smooth, always sensible, but they never quite settled right. Pastor Gideon Lattimore, a circuit preacher who ministered to the scattered congregations in the parish, also harbored a deep-seated disquiet about the place. His parishioners spoke of it in hushed tones. After the Sunday services were over and the children were out of earshot, they spoke of travelers who were seen arriving at the inn, healthy and in good spirits, but were never seen at the ferry crossing or in any of the neighboring settlements. These were not just soldiers or drifters, but respectable families, merchants, people who had destinations and people waiting for them. The whispers always came back to one central, unnerving detail: the stew. Aunt Zora Duplessis, the cook at Cypress Crossings, was a woman known for her culinary skill. She was a free woman of color who had worked in fine kitchens in New Orleans before the war, and her presence in the Bellamy's kitchen lent an air of legitimacy to their establishment. Her turtle stew, in particular, was famous. It was rich and dark, seasoned with herbs she gathered from the surrounding woods, and it was the centerpiece of the evening meal offered to every guest. But the local talk, the quiet stories shared between neighbors, suggested a sinister quality to this celebrated dish. It was said that after partaking of the stew, guests would often complain of a sudden and violent illness. They would retire to their rooms, weak and sweating, and would not be seen again. Eustace would explain to any inquirers that the guest had been struck by a swamp fever, a common and often deadly ailment, and had either passed in the night or had departed at dawn, eager to reach a proper doctor in a larger town. The explanations were always delivered with a somber, regretful air that was difficult to question. Yet, the pattern was too consistent. The stew, the sickness, the disappearance. It was a sequence that repeated itself with a quiet, methodical deadliness. The locals began to avoid the trace road after dark, and mothers would call their children indoors when they saw the lanterns at Cypress Crossings flicker to life through the trees. They did not know what was happening inside that sagging cypress building, but they knew it was a place that consumed people, a place where the journey ended abruptly and without a trace. The hospitality offered by the Bellamys began to feel like a spider's welcome to a fly, a gentle, silken courtesy that masked a ravenous hunger. The question hung in the humid air, unspoken but felt by all who lived in the shadow of the inn. Was Cypress Crossing simply an unlucky place in a time of widespread death and disease, or was it something else entirely? Was it a hungry place? A place that had learned to wear a human smile while it waited patiently for the next meal to arrive on its doorstep? The true nature of the inn's hospitality was confined not to its public spaces, the welcoming gallery or the communal dining room, but to the private corridors and the locked guest rooms where the sickness took hold. The transition from welcomed guest to silent victim was a swift and terrifying one, managed with the same cold efficiency that Corinne applied to all her domestic duties. When a traveler, flush with the warmth of the turtle stew and perhaps a glass of whiskey, began to feel the first unsettling cramps in their stomach or the strange metallic taste that bloomed on their tongue, they would be guided with gentle concern to their room. Corinne would lead the way, a lamp held high, her face a mask of sympathy. She would promise to have Aunt Zora prepare a soothing tea, a remedy for the ague that so often plagued newcomers to the bayou. The rooms themselves were Spartan but clean. Each contained a simple rope bed with a straw-stuffed mattress, a small table with a wash basin and pitcher, and a single wooden chair. The air within was always still and cool, the thick cypress walls insulating against the evening's heat. But there was a dampness that clung to everything, a smell of wet earth and something else, something faintly acrid that caught in the back of the throat. Once the guest was settled, the door would be closed, and the quiet of the inn would descend. But for the afflicted traveler, the night was just beginning. The illness would escalate with a terrifying speed, far faster than any natural swamp fever. A chilling sweat would break out, soaking the thin cotton sheets, followed by waves of nausea that left the victim weak and trembling. They would be too disoriented to cry for help, or perhaps some instinct would warn them against it. The silence of the house, which had seemed peaceful an hour before, now felt predatory. Every creak of the floorboards in the hallway, every rustle of the leaves outside the single window, sounded like a footstep, an approach. The last thing they would hear before consciousness faded would be the steady, indifferent drone of the frogs and insects from the bayou, a sound that had been a backdrop to their evening meal but was now a funeral dirge. The public face of hospitality had peeled away, revealing the private, suffocating reality of the trap. In these small, dark rooms, the whispers of the locals found their substance, and the journey that had brought so many to Cypress Crossings reached its final, unrecorded destination. The stage was now set for these whispers to gain a voice, for the pattern of disappearances to be noticed by someone who was in a position to start asking questions that could not be so easily dismissed with a plausible lie. The machinery of Cypress Crossings operated with the quiet, unhurried rhythm of the seasons. It had its own planting and its own harvest, dictated not by the almanac but by the dusty arrival of Hiram Thatch's stagecoach. On a humid afternoon in late May of 1862, the coach disgorged 2 new travelers into the oppressive stillness of the inn's front yard. They were Abel Merriweather and his young wife, Naomi Pike. Abel was a watchmaker by trade, a man whose delicate, precise movements seemed ill-suited to the brutish realities of the war. He was fleeing the encroaching conflict in Tennessee, hoping to establish a new shop in the relative safety of Vicksburg, a city he believed was too vital to the Confederacy to ever fall. His humanizing detail was a constant, nervous habit of checking a silver pocket watch, not for the time, but for the comforting, rhythmic beat of its escapement, a tiny mechanical heart that imposed order on a chaotic world. Naomi was younger, her face still holding the soft contours of girlhood. She carried with her a small, leather-bound book filled with pressed flowers, a fragile catalog of the home she had been forced to abandon. As they stepped down from the coach, the oppressive quiet of the place seemed to press in on them, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and decay. An empty rocking chair on the gallery moved slowly back and forth, pushed by an invisible breeze, its gentle creak the only sound other than the ever-present chorus of insects from the bayou. Eustace Bellamy greeted them on the gallery steps, his smile as placid and welcoming as ever. He expressed his sympathies for their long journey and assured them they had found a place of rest and safety. He led them inside, to the heavy, leather-bound guest ledger that sat on a lectern in the dim foyer. The book was half filled with names, written in various hands, a silent testament to the many who had passed through these doors. With a practiced flourish, Eustace dipped a pen in an inkwell and recorded their presence. Abel Merriweather and Naomi Pike arrived May 28, 1862. His own script was a model of elegant cursive, a stark contrast to the hurried scrawls of his guests. He informed them they were just in time for the evening meal, and that Aunt Zora's turtle stew was particularly fine tonight. The couple, weary from days of travel, readily agreed. Corinne appeared as if summoned by an unspoken signal, a tall, silent figure who led them down a dark corridor to their room. She did not speak, but simply opened a door and gestured for them to enter before receding back into the shadows of the house. The room was clean, but it held a faint, lingering odor of bleach and something else, something vaguely metallic and unpleasant that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Abel, ever the pragmatist, attributed it to the dampness of the bayou climate. He was simply grateful for a solid roof and a bed that was not moving. Hiram Thatch, meanwhile, settled his horses and took his own meal in the kitchen, as was his custom. He confirmed with Eustace that he would be departing at dawn expecting to take his 2 new passengers onward toward the ferry. Eustace merely nodded, his gaze distant, as if the matter was already of no consequence to him. The stage driver's logs, a meticulous record of every passenger and every fare collected, were his livelihood. On that day, he duly noted the drop-off of 2 souls at Cypress Crossings. The corresponding entry for their pickup the following morning would remain conspicuously blank. The dining room that evening was a study in contrasts. The low-beamed ceiling and dark wood walls absorbed the light from the few candles, creating pools of shadow in the corners of the room. Yet the table was set with clean linens and mismatched but polished silverware. Aunt Zora's stew was served in heavy earthenware bowls, its aroma rich and savory. Abel and Naomi ate gratefully, the warm food a comfort after their long ordeal. Abel remarked to his wife that he could taste an unusual spice, something earthy and slightly sharp, but he assumed it was just a local herb he did not recognize. It was only as he was finishing his bowl that he noticed the persistent metallic taste beginning to bloom on his palate. He took a long drink of water from the cistern, but the strange flavor remained, a chemical ghost that clung to his tongue. A short while later, back in the quiet of their room, the true sickness began. It started for Naomi with a chilling sweat that had nothing to do with the humid night air. A wave of nausea left her weak and trembling. For Abel, it was a sharp, twisting cramp in his gut that stole his breath. He tried to stand, to call for help, but his legs would not hold him. The world began to tilt and swim, the feeble candlelight seeming to recede down a long, dark tunnel. He saw his wife collapse onto the thin mattress, her breathing shallow and ragged. His last conscious thought was of his silver watch, its steady ticking now a frantic, racing heartbeat counting down to an unknown and terrifying silence. The house remained still. No one came to check on them. The only sound was the gentle ticking of rain beginning to fall outside, a soft, percussive rhythm against the roof, and a steady, hollow drumming as it dripped from the eaves into a large wooden barrel placed just outside by the cistern. In the kitchen, Aunt Zora Duplessis worked in a state of carefully controlled dread. She had seen this sequence unfold too many times. The special preparation of the stew, on nights when certain types of travelers arrived, the quiet instructions from Corinne, the subsequent illness that was never spoken of the next day. Zora was a captive of her circumstances. The war had erased the life she had known in New Orleans, and at her age, with the world in chaos, Cypress Crossings was a sanctuary of a sort, albeit a damned one. Her complicity was a heavy cloak she wore every day, and her fear of the Bellamys was a cold, hard stone in her stomach. That night, after the meal was served and the house had fallen into its waiting quiet, Corinne entered the kitchen. She did not need to speak. She simply pointed toward the chamber pot that had been brought from the guest's room. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, then flickered toward the back door. She told Zora, her voice a low whisper that was more command than request, to use the barrel by the cistern. This was a new and horrifying instruction. Previously, the waste from the sick rooms had been buried in a lime pit deep in the woods. This change in protocol was chilling. The barrel was for collecting rainwater, used for laundry and cleaning. It was a part of the inn's lifeblood. To contaminate it seemed an act of madness, unless the contamination itself was the point. Zora, her hands trembling slightly, did as she was told. She carried the heavy pot outside into the drizzling rain. The cistern barrel was massive, made of thick cypress staves bound with iron hoops. A heavy wooden lid sat slightly askew on top. When she lifted it, the smell that rose from within was not the clean scent of rainwater, but a foul, chemical odor, sharp and acrid. With a sense of profound self-loathing, she emptied the pot's contents, the dark, viscous black bile of the poisoned guests, mixing with the water within. She felt she was not merely disposing of evidence, but actively feeding a poison back into the heart of the house, participating in the next turn of a cycle she could not comprehend but viscerally feared. Was the curse in the food she was forced to prepare, or was it drawn from the very water they used to clean the dishes? The question was a venomous serpent coiling in her mind. The disappearance of the watchmaker and his wife did not go unnoticed for long. Abel Merriweather was a man of meticulous habits, and he had arranged for letters of credit to be sent ahead to a bank in Monroe. When he failed to arrive to claim them after a week, the banker, following instructions, sent a query back to Abel's last known point of departure. That query eventually found its way to Constable Sylvain Marchand. Marchand was a practical man, worn down by the general lawlessness the war had engendered. His jurisdiction was too large, his resources too few. But the report on the Merriweathers troubled him because it was the third such inquiry he had received in as many weeks. A cotton factor from Natchez and a Confederate courier on special assignment had also been traced to Cypress Crossings, only to vanish from the face of the earth. 3 missing parties in 3 weeks was not a coincidence, not even in wartime. It was a pattern. Constable Marchand rode out to the inn on a gray, overcast morning. The place looked even more sullen and unwelcoming under the flat, colorless sky. He found Eustace on the gallery, calmly whittling one of his small wooden birds. The proprietor greeted the constable with his usual unruffled courtesy, offering him a seat and a cool drink. Marchand declined. He stated his business directly, listing the names of the missing persons. He told Eustace that his inn was the last place any of them had been reliably seen. Eustace listened with an expression of grave concern. He shook his head slowly, saying that the constable's news was most distressing. He confirmed that he remembered each of the parties mentioned. He then retrieved his guest ledger, the book's neat entries a testament to his orderly business practices. He showed Marchand the names. Then, from a small wooden box, he produced 3 separate, folded notes. He explained that each of the parties had been forced to depart suddenly and unexpectedly. The cotton factor, he said, had received an urgent message about a family illness and had hired a local man with a skiff to take him downriver at once. The courier's horse had thrown a shoe, and he had chosen to proceed on foot rather than wait for the farrier. As for the Merriweathers, Eustace claimed they had been offered a ride with a family heading west in a covered wagon, a safer and more direct route to Vicksburg, given the state of the river. The notes, purportedly left by the guests to settle their accounts, supported each of these stories. Marchand examined the scraps of paper. The handwriting on each was slightly different, yet there was a similar cadence to the phrasing, a stilted formality that felt unnatural. He suspected they were forgeries, but he could not prove it. Eustace's explanations were perfectly plausible, maddeningly so. In a time of such upheaval, sudden changes in travel plans were common. The constable had no bodies, no witnesses, nothing but a ledger full of names, and a growing certainty that he was being expertly lied to. He left Cypress Crossings with a sense of profound frustration. The image of Eustace's calm, helpful face burned into his mind. He knew he was standing at the edge of a dark and terrible secret, but the ground was soft, and he could find no firm footing to begin digging. The truth of the inn was not in its books or in the words of its proprietor. It was hidden deeper, in the very foundation of the place. The whispers of a curse were beginning to solidify into the structure of a crime, but the building itself held the key to its mechanics, a secret waiting beneath the worn and silent floorboards for someone to notice the hollow sound of their own footsteps. The quiet horror of Cypress Crossings was not a supernatural curse that bled from the soil, but a meticulously engineered system of human design, a physical trap constructed of wood, brick, and iron. It was a mechanism hidden in plain sight, its efficiency masked by the mundane facade of an ordinary roadside inn. The discovery of this machine was not made by a lawman or a suspicious neighbor, but by a man who had nothing to lose and a habit of noticing things that were out of place. His name was Julian Cormack, a drifter and a survivor, pushed onto the trace road by the chaotic tides of the war. Julian had been a carpenter's apprentice in another life, before the conflict had claimed his master and his trade. His one humanizing quality was a deep, instinctual understanding of how things were built. He could look at a structure and see not just the walls and roof, but the joints, the stresses, the secret weaknesses. It was a skill that had kept him alive, allowing him to find the most secure barn to sleep in, the driest shelter in a storm. He arrived at the inn on foot, with only a few coins in his pocket, enough for a single night's lodging and a bowl of stew. He was not the kind of prosperous traveler the Bellamys typically targeted, and for that reason, he was deemed safe, an insignificant piece of human flotsam who would be gone by morning. He was assigned room 3, a small, damp chamber at the back of the inn, its single window looking out over the dark, brooding slope that led down to the bayou. The room felt wrong to him from the moment he stepped inside. It was not merely the chill that clung to the air or the persistent smell of lye and something else, something swampy and metallic. It was the floor. As he paced the narrow space, his worn boots mapping its small geography, he detected a subtle but distinct difference in the sound his footsteps made. Near the bed, the cypress planks were solid, the sound a dull, satisfying thud. But in the center of the room, for a space of about 6 feet, the tone was different. It was a hollow, resonant sound, as if there were a void just beneath the surface. A carpenter's son knows the voice of wood, and this wood was speaking of a secret. His drifter's caution warred with his craftsman's curiosity. He waited until the house had settled into the profound quiet of deep night, a silence broken only by the chirring of insects and the distant, mournful call of a screech owl. He knelt on the floor, the rough wood cool against his hands. He ran his fingers along the seams of the planks in the hollow-sounding section. They were too perfect, the fit too tight, unless they were designed to be. He used the tip of his knife, a tool he kept honed to a razor's edge, to probe the hairline cracks. Near the edge of one plank, the blade's tip snagged on something. It was not wood, it was metal. Working with the painstaking patience of a man dismantling a bomb, he carefully scraped away the grime and wax that had been rubbed into the grain. He uncovered the recessed head of a small hooked latch, cleverly sunk into the wood so as to be almost invisible. It took him the better part of an hour, using his knife as both probe and lever, to work the central plank loose from its tongue-and-groove fittings. It lifted with a soft sigh of displaced air. The smell that rose from the darkness below was overpowering, a fetid mix of stagnant water, rot, and the cloying, unmistakable scent of death. He peered into the opening. There was no cellar, no storage space. Instead, he saw the beginning of a gently sloping channel, lined with dark, moss-slicked bricks. The entire section of the floor, he now realized, was a single, large trapdoor, its edges masterfully concealed. On the underside of the plank he had lifted, he could see the dark, greasy sheen of well-oiled hinges. This was no mere architectural quirk. It was a piece of machinery. It was a maw. Julian, a man who had seen the carnage of a battlefield, felt a coldness spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the damp night air. He understood that he was not in a guest house. He was in a slaughterhouse, a place designed to make people disappear with silent mechanical efficiency. He carefully replaced the plank, rubbing dirt back into the seam to conceal his work. He did not sleep. He sat on his bed in the darkness, his knife in his hand, and waited for the dawn, listening to the house breathe around him. He did not have to wait long to understand the full purpose of the mechanism he had uncovered. Perhaps an hour before the first hint of morning grayed the sky, he heard the sounds. They were faint, almost imperceptible, the sounds of people who were masters of moving in silence. A soft scraping noise from the hallway, the sound of a heavy weight being dragged. Then, the door to the room next to his, room 4, creaked open. Julian pressed his ear to the thin cypress wall, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. He could hear the muffled sounds of movement, a low grunt of exertion, and then the same hollow, resonant sound he had discovered in his own room, but louder, more definitive. A deep, solid thud, as if a heavy lid had been lifted and set back down. There was a long silence, and then he heard a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his days. It was a wet, sliding sound, followed by a gentle splash, an obscene punctuation mark in the dead quiet of the night. He knew, with a certainty that defied reason, that he had just heard a human body being delivered into the earth. The antechamber to the graveyard was not a plot of land, but the very rooms of the inn itself. The full, horrifying tableau of the Bellamy's operation was revealed not to Julian, but to the omniscient, unblinking gaze of the night itself. In the corridor, Eustace and Corinne worked with the synchronized, wordless efficiency of a surgical team. The body they moved was that of a lone traveler, a merchant who had arrived the previous evening, his saddlebags heavy with goods. He was now wrapped tightly in a thick wool carpet, his form a lumpy, anonymous bundle. They did not speak. They did not need to. Every movement was practiced, honed by countless repetitions. Eustace took the head, Corinne the feet. They navigated the turn into room 4, their feet making no sound on the floorboards. Inside, Eustace lit a single lantern, its light kept low and shielded. The swinging glow cast their shadows, huge and distorted, against the walls. Corinne pulled back the small rug that covered the center of the floor, revealing the faint but visible seams of the large trapdoor. Eustace used a special tool, a simple T-shaped handle of wrought iron, to engage a hidden lock. He gave it a quarter turn, and then, together, they lifted the heavy section of flooring. It swung upward on its silent, oiled hinges, revealing the dark, waiting mouth of the brick-lined trench below. A lantern, hanging on a hook just inside the opening, cast a long, wavering path of light down the length of the culvert. The brickwork was coated in a dark, greasy slime, and the water at the bottom was black and still, pulsing slowly as if with a sluggish life of its own. The channel was a marvel of grim engineering, sloping at a precise, shallow angle away from the house, running for some 200 feet underground before emptying into a deep, secluded backwater of Bayou Masson, a place choked with cypress knees and impenetrable thickets where the current was slow and the water was deep. Eustace and Corinne positioned the carpeted body over the opening. With a coordinated shove, they sent it sliding into the trench. It landed with a soft, percussive splash that was absorbed by the damp earth and the thick walls. They held the trapdoor open for a moment longer, watching as the dark shape was borne slowly, inexorably, away on the sluggish current, a silent, final journey toward the bayou's digestive embrace. Then, they closed the hatch, replaced the rug, and extinguished the lantern, plunging the room back into absolute darkness. The entire procedure had taken less than 5 minutes. Aunt Zora knew. She did not know the specifics of the trapdoor or the brick-lined trench, but she knew the results. She saw the guests arrive, she served them the tainted stew, and she saw their belongings discreetly bundled and burned or sold to the unscrupulous ferryman, Obed Raines. who asked no questions as long as his palm was crossed with silver. Her complicity was a poison in her own soul, and it was beginning to eat her alive. The final breaking point came a few days after Julian Cormack had vanished into the dawn, his bed untouched, his presence erased. Zora was tasked with cleaning room 4 after its most recent occupant's early departure. While stripping the bed, her fingers closed around something small and hard that had fallen between the mattress and the wall. It was a small, carved wooden dog, crudely made, clearly the work of a child. She remembered the merchant who had stayed in the room and how he had spoken fondly of his young son waiting for him back home. He had told her the boy was clever with his hands. The small, pathetic token of a father's love was too much for her fragile conscience to bear. She found Corinne in the root cellar, surrounded by the earthy smell of damp soil and stored vegetables. In her hand, Zora clutched the small wooden dog. She held it out, her hand shaking. For the first time, she gave voice to the terror she had held inside for so long. She told Corinne that a man with a son was gone. She asked what became of these people, her voice a ragged whisper in the cool, still air of the cellar. Corinne's reaction was not one of anger or denial. She simply stopped what she was doing and turned her full, unnerving attention to the cook. Her eyes were flat and cold, like river stones. She looked at the wooden dog in Zora's hand and then back at her face. She told Zora that what became of their guests was not her concern. Her concern, she explained in a voice devoid of any emotion, was the kitchen. Then, she reached into a small pouch she wore at her waist and produced a gold coin, a sum far greater than Zora's weekly wages. She pressed it into Zora's free hand, her fingers cold and strong. She called it a gift, a token of appreciation for her loyalty and her discretion. It was not a bribe, it was a leash. As Zora stared at the coin, Corinne leaned closer, her voice dropping to a near inaudible whisper. She told Zora that the bayou was a hungry place. It kept what they gave it, she said, and it did not distinguish between the body of a stranger and the body of a cook who asked too many questions. The threat was absolute, delivered with the casual finality of a death sentence. Zora's burgeoning courage collapsed, smothered by a wave of cold, paralyzing fear. She pocketed the coin, the weight of it a brand against her skin. She had her answer. The Bellamys were not merely murderers hiding their crimes. They were caretakers, priests of a sort, tending to a dark and hungry god whose altar was hidden beneath the floorboards and whose domain was the black, silent water of the bayou. The mechanism was in place, the system was perfected, and the staff were bound by fear and greed. But the war, which had for so long provided the steady stream of victims that fed the inn, was now creeping closer. The quiet, methodical rhythm of Cypress crossings was about to be shattered by the arrival of a wagon filled with wounded men, a surge of humanity that the grim, silent trap was never designed to handle. The reckoning was coming, not on the back of a constable's horse, but in a storm of thunder and blood. The storm arrived just after dusk, a malevolent entity that seemed to claw its way out of the Gulf and across the swampy lowlands of Louisiana. It was a storm of biblical proportions, a churning, violent squall that turned the sky a bruised purple-black and unleashed a torrent of rain that was less a downpour and more a solid, descending wall of water. The wind screamed through the cypress trees, tearing at the Spanish moss and sending branches, heavy as a man's limbs, crashing to the saturated earth. Thunder, a constant, concussive barrage, shook the very foundations of Cypress crossings, and lightning bleached the landscape in stark, instantaneous flashes of white, illuminating the writhing trees and the churning, muddy yard in scenes of stark, gothic horror. The deluge quickly overwhelmed the land's ability to absorb it, The trace road dissolved into a river of mud, and the bayou behind the inn began to swell, its black water rising with an alarming speed, the steady drumming of rain on its surface punctuated by the deeper, more urgent beat of the floodwaters against the hidden mouth of the culvert. It was a night unfit for man or beast, a night when the world seemed to be coming to a violent, chaotic end. And it was on this night that the war, which had for so long been a distant engine providing a steady supply of victims, came crashing, quite literally, to the Bellamy's door. Through the shrieking wind and booming thunder, a new sound emerged, the splintering crack of wood and the panicked whinny of horses. A Confederate ambulance wagon, a simple buckboard bearing a canvas cover, had been struggling along the trace, trying to reach a field hospital rumored to be set up near the ferry crossing. One of its wheels, plunging into a newly formed sinkhole, had shattered, pitching the wagon onto its side and sending its suffering cargo tumbling into the mud. Eustace Bellamy, drawn to the gallery by the commotion, saw the disaster illuminated by a flash of lightning. Two beleaguered drivers were struggling to control the terrified horses while trying to attend to the men who had been thrown from the wagon bed. There were 6 of them, wounded soldiers from a skirmish near the Arkansas border, their gray uniforms stained with a mixture of mud and blood. Eustace, ever the picture of calm respectability, did not hesitate. To turn away wounded soldiers of the Confederacy in such a storm would be an act of inexcusable treason, an invitation for the kind of scrutiny he and his sister had so carefully avoided. With an air of solemn civic duty, he called for the drivers to bring the men inside. The dining room, the scene of so many quiet poisonings, was quickly converted into a makeshift infirmary. Pallets were laid out on the floor, and the 6 wounded men were carried in and laid gently upon them. They were a cross-section of the war's anonymous suffering. A boy, Private Asa Lemaire, barely 17, with a feverish glint in his eyes and a festering shrapnel wound in his thigh. A grizzled farmer, Corporal Rowan Tate, his arm in a crude sling, his face a mask of stoic pain. The other 4 were in similar states of misery, their bodies broken, their spirits hovering between exhaustion and delirium. The 2 drivers, grateful for the unexpected sanctuary, were given a room to themselves, while Eustace and Corinne set about the task of caring for the wounded. Corinne moved among the pallets with a quiet, spectral grace, her face betraying no emotion, not pity, not revulsion. She was the very picture of a ministering angel, wiping fevered brows with a cool cloth, offering sips of water. She informed the senior NCO, Corporal Tate, that she had a supply of laudanum, a tincture of opium that would help ease their pain and allow them to rest. The soldier, his own agony a constant, burning fire in his shoulder, accepted the offer with profound gratitude. Corinne's methodical dispensation of the medicine was an act of chilling duplicity. She was not measuring the doses for comfort, but for oblivion. To each man, she administered a quantity far in excess of what was needed for pain, a dose calculated to plunge them into a stupor so deep it bordered on coma. Within the hour, the groans and whimpers that had filled the dining room faded into a drugged, unnatural silence. The 6 men laid out like offerings on an altar. The storm raged on, its fury providing a perfect, chaotic cover for the work that was to come. With the soldiers incapacitated and their drivers asleep, Eustace and Corinne began their grim task. But this was not the familiar, controlled process of disposing of a single, silent victim. This was a mass casualty event, and it strained their meticulous system to its breaking point. They could not use the individual rooms, each with its own hatch. They had to use the dining room itself, where a larger, secondary trapdoor, concealed beneath the main dining table, provided access to the same brick-lined culvert. It was a feature designed for bulk disposal, a contingency they had never before been forced to use. The first body, that of Private Lemaire, was slid into the trench without issue. But as they positioned the second man, Corporal Tate, the mechanism, unused and swollen by the intense humidity, protested. The hinges of the large trapdoor let out a loud, groaning creak, a sound that, for a terrifying moment, cut through the din of the storm. They froze, listening, but the house remained silent. They proceeded, their movements now hurried, less precise. The second body was dispatched, but the sheer volume of their task, the unaccustomed weight and number of the victims, made them clumsy. A boot knocked against the side of the opening. A canteen slipped and clattered on the brick lining below before being washed away. These were small, insignificant noises, but in the context of their perfect, silent system, they were loud, damning errors. Outside, in a small, leaky tenant cabin not 50 yards from the main house, Pastor Gideon Lattimore was a prisoner of the storm. His horse had gone lame earlier that day, and he had been forced to accept the Bellamy's offer of shelter, though he did so with a deep and abiding unease. He had refused their offer of a room in the inn, preferring the relative privacy of the cabin, a choice that likely saved his life. He could not sleep. The thunder and his own troubled thoughts were a potent combination. It was during a lull in the storm's fury, a moment when the wind held its breath, that he heard it. It was a strange, dragging, scraping sound coming from the direction of the inn, followed by a distinct, heavy creak of wood. He dismissed it at first as the sound of the old building groaning under the assault of the wind. But then, a few minutes later, he heard it again. This time, it was followed by a different sound, a sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It came not from the house, but from the ground itself, from the direction of the sloping land that led to the bayou. It was a deep, guttural, gulping sound, a wet, hollow noise like something large and subterranean taking a great, satisfying drink. It was the sound of the flood-swollen culvert, engorged with rainwater and the 6 bodies the Bellamys had just fed it, answering the offering with a surge of hydrostatic pressure. To the terrified pastor, huddled in his dark cabin, it sounded like the bayou itself, the very earth, had just swallowed something whole. He spent the rest of the night in prayer, his heart cold with a certainty that he had been a witness to an act of profound and unspeakable evil. The dawn broke on a world washed clean and brutally rearranged. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of bruised clouds and a landscape drowning in water. The trace road was gone, a churning morass of red-brown mud. The bayou had overflowed its banks, turning the entire area behind the inn into a shallow, murky lake. When the 2 ambulance drivers awoke, Eustace met them with a somber face. He told them a terrible story. He claimed that in the night, the wounded men's fevers had broken, turning into a violent, delirious madness. They had become convinced that the inn was under attack by Union soldiers. In their crazed state, they had burst out into the storm, fleeing into the darkness before anyone could stop them. He told the drivers he had searched, but the night and the flood had swallowed them. He offered his deepest regrets. The story was thin, almost ludicrous, but in the chaotic aftermath of the storm, with the evidence of its fury all around them, the shell-shocked drivers had no reason to disbelieve it. They managed to repair their wagon and departed, carrying the grim news of 6 more soldiers lost to the unforgiving wilderness of war. But the bayou, having taken its grisly tribute, was not as discreet as the Bellamys had always assumed. The sheer volume of water that had flushed through the culvert had created a powerful, scouring current. The system had been overloaded. Downstream, where the backwater rejoined the main channel of Bayou Masson, the flood began to disgorge the secrets it had been fed. Hiram Thatch, The stage driver was checking the integrity of a small wooden bridge near the ferry landing when he saw it. Bobbing in the eddy behind a cypress knee was a standard-issue Confederate Army boot. Such flotsam was not entirely unusual in these times, but as he hooked it with a long branch and pulled it to the bank, he saw with a jolt of pure horror that the boot was not empty. A human foot, pale and bloated, was still laced tightly inside. The discovery of the boot was the first piece of tangible, undeniable evidence that the earth around Cypress Crossings was giving back its dead. The catastrophe of the storm had done what Constable Marchand's suspicions could not. It had broken the seal on the Bellamy's carefully constructed tomb, turning rumor and whispered fear into a gruesome, undeniable fact. The ground itself was now a witness, and an inquiry was no longer a matter of if, but when. The digging was about to begin. The discovery of the boot, with its grisly contents, was the crack in the dam of silence and fear that had protected Cypress Crossings. Hiram Thatch, his face a grim mask of resolve, delivered the sodden evidence directly to Constable Sylvan Marchand in Monroe. For Marchand, this was the tangible proof he had lacked, the fulcrum upon which he could finally apply the weight of the law. Armed with the sworn testimony of the stage driver and the deeply unsettling account from Pastor Gideon Lattimore regarding the noises on the night of the storm, the constable assembled a small posse of grim-faced men. They were farmers and merchants, men whose own vague suspicions about the Bellamy's Inn were now galvanized into a need for action. They rode out to the crossings under a sky the color of old iron, the air still heavy and damp from the recent deluge. The ground squelched under their horses' hooves, and the red clay of Ouachita Parish clung to their boots like a premonition of the graves they were about to uncover. Eustace Bellamy met them on the gallery, his composure as immaculate as ever. He registered no surprise, no fear, only a kind of weary resignation. When Constable Marchand informed him that he had come to search the property, Eustace simply nodded and stepped aside, a gracious host to the very end. The search of the inn itself revealed nothing. The rooms were clean, the floors scrubbed, the beds neatly made. The malevolent machinery beneath the floorboards remained hidden, its secrets intact. But Marchand was not looking for a mechanism. He was looking for its results. His focus was on the land, the soft, forgiving earth that sloped from the back of the house toward the bayou. Guided by a grim intuition, Marchand ordered his men to start digging along the path he imagined the underground culvert, described by the now absent Julian Cormack in a hastily scrawled letter that had found its way to the constable, might take. They began near the water's edge, in a low-lying area thick with palmetto scrub. The work was slow and arduous. The soil was a dense, sucking mixture of clay and silt, and the air was thick with the hum of mosquitoes and the fetid smell of the disturbed swamp. For hours, their shovels turned up nothing but mud and roots. But then, one of the men let out a sharp cry. His spade had struck something that was not a rock. It was the unmistakable, dull thud of metal striking bone. They worked more carefully now, clearing the soil away with their hands. What they uncovered was not a single, formal grave, but a shallow, haphazard trench, a mass interment site where bodies had been tumbled together with a shocking lack of ceremony. The first body was that of a man in the tattered remnants of a Confederate uniform, then another and another. The final count from that first trench was 12. 12 human forms in varying states of decay, their identities erased by the relentless chemistry of the Louisiana soil. Dr. Lucien Favreau, the parish coroner, a man whose professional detachment had been hardened by years of dealing with the grim realities of frontier life, worked with a methodical grimness. He noted the state of the remains, the signs of trauma, though the soft tissue was largely gone, making a precise cause of death impossible to determine for most. Yet, he found something that was, in its own way, as damning as a bullet hole. Tucked into the rotted pockets of several of the victims, or clutched in their skeletal hands, were small, flat discs of stamped metal. They were meal tokens, the kind of scrip used in some establishments for guests to pay for their supper. Each token bore the distinct, stylized image of 3 intertwined cypress trees. They were unique to Cypress Crossings. The graveyard now had a direct physical link to the inn. The piles of red clay beside the open graves stood as stark, obscene monuments to the dozen silent testimonies they had unearthed. As the news of the gruesome discovery spread through the parish, it loosened the tongue of a woman who held another piece of the puzzle. Beatrice Lang was the widow of a ferryman who had recently died of swamp fever. Her husband had been a man who drank too much and talked too little, but he had occasionally worked for Obed Raines, the primary ferryman, and had done business with the Bellamys. After his death, while sorting through his meager possessions, Beatrice found a small, damp-spotted ledger page tucked inside an old almanac. She could not read well, but she recognized the elegant, precise handwriting of Corinne Bellamy, whom she had seen making entries at the ferry landing. The page contained no names, only a cryptic series of columns. The first column listed initials A, M, N, P, R, T. The second listed numbers that seemed to correspond to weights, figures ranging from 120 to over 200. The final column, the one that made a cold dread settle in Beatrice's stomach, was headed with a single, chilling word: yields. Beside each set of initials and each weight was a number representing a sum of money, often broken down into smaller amounts next to items like watch, boots, or tools. It was a bookkeeper's accounting of the dead, a clinical, financial record of the profits extracted from each human life. Realizing the horrific significance of the document, and with her husband gone and no longer subject to the Bellamy's influence, Beatrice brought the ledger scrap to Constable Marchand. It was the voice of the victims, a cold, clear testament from beyond the grave, written in the hand of one of their killers. The initials A, M, and N, P were a ghostly echo of Abel Merriweather and Naomi Pike. R, T was a silent roll call for Corporal Rowan Tate. The case against the Bellamys seemed overwhelming, a fortress of evidence built from bone, metal, and paper. The preliminary hearing was held at the parish courthouse in Monroe, a stuffy, wood-paneled room that smelled of dust and stale tobacco. The entire parish seemed to have turned out, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and grim satisfaction. Eustace and Corinne Bellamy sat at a table at the front of the room, flanked by a lawyer from New Orleans whose expensive suit seemed wildly out of place. Corinne was a statue, her face pale and impassive. Eustace, however, projected an air of wrong dignity. When it was his turn to speak, he did not deny the existence of the bodies. To do so would have been pointless. Instead, he offered an explanation that was both monstrous and, in the context of the times, devilishly clever. He claimed that Cypress Crossings had been struck by a virulent outbreak of typhoid fever. The dead, he argued, were its unfortunate victims. Fearing a parish-wide panic and a quarantine that would have ruined him, he had made the difficult but necessary decision to dispose of the bodies quickly and quietly, burying them in a lime-puddled fever pit to prevent the spread of the disease. He presented it as a regrettable but essential act of public sanitation, a burden he had shouldered for the good of the community. It was a lie, but a plausible one. Fevers were a constant, terrifying reality of life in the South. Dr. Favreau could not conclusively refute it. The state of the remains made it impossible to distinguish death by poison from death by disease. The meal tokens, Eustace's lawyer argued, were merely proof that the deceased had been guests, nothing more. The ledger page was dismissed as a fabrication, the nonsensical scribblings of a grieving, addled widow. The tide of public opinion, so firmly against the Bellamys, began to waver. Their story, however repellent, touched upon a deep, collective fear of pestilence. The final, decisive blow to justice came not from an argument, but from a position of power. The presiding official was the parish magistrate, Noel Dufresne, a man whose fortunes were deeply and secretly entangled with those of Eustace Bellamy. Eustace, with the gold and valuables harvested from his victims, had become a silent moneylender, a financial spider at the center of a web of local debt. Magistrate Dufresne was one of the largest flies caught in that web. His plantation was mortgaged to Eustace, his political survival dependent on the continued goodwill of the man standing before him. After listening to the evidence and Eustace's explanation, Dufresne rendered his judgment. He declared that while the Bellamy's methods had been unorthodox and alarming, there was insufficient evidence to proceed with a full trial for murder. He accepted the fever pit explanation, officially classifying the 12 bodies as victims of disease. He levied a heavy fine against Eustace for failing to report the deaths, a punishment that was a mere slap on the wrist, a piece of political theater. He ordered the remains to be reinterred in the church cemetery with a proper Christian service. Case closed. A wave of stunned silence, followed by a murmur of angry disbelief, swept through the courtroom. Constable Marchand stood frozen, his face a mask of impotent fury. He had delivered the bodies, the evidence, the motive. He had brought the crime to the seat of justice, only to watch justice itself be corrupted and dismissed. The parish would name the dead, but it would not name their murderers. The graveyard at Cypress Crossings had been legally acknowledged, its existence entered into the public record. But the greater crime, the human machinery that had filled it, was being deliberately buried, covered over by the weight of power, money, and fear. The law had failed, but the land and the memory of the people who lived on it were less easily swayed. Justice had been stifled in the courtroom, but a more elemental form of reckoning was yet to come. The inn itself, now a place of public infamy, was about to be cleansed, not by a judge's decree, but by fire. The magistrate's verdict was a legal absolution, but it was not a cleansing. For the people of Ouachita Parish, the name Cypress Crossings had become a stain, a permanent mark of disgrace on the community's conscience. Though Eustace and Corinne Bellamy were free by the letter of the law, they were prisoners of their own infamy. No traveler would stop at their inn, no local would sell them supplies. The stagecoaches, now running more regularly as the war ground on elsewhere, began using the longer, safer river road exclusively. The trace that passed the Bellamy's door fell into disuse, the ruts slowly healing over with grass and weeds. The inn stood isolated, a monument to a horror that the law had refused to name. Then, on a dry, windy night in the autumn of 1863, a year after the bodies had been dug from its soil, Cypress Crossings burned. The official report, filed with a distinct lack of investigative rigor, cited the cause as a lightning strike from a freak autumn storm. But there was no storm that night. The sky was clear, filled with a cold, indifferent canopy of stars. The locals knew the truth. They knew it was a fire of human origin, a fire of judgment, the only kind left to a community whose legal system had failed them so profoundly. They watched from a distance as the flames consumed the dark cypress planks, the sagging gallery, the roof that had sheltered so much evil. The fire burned with a terrifying intensity, as if the wood itself were saturated with a guilt that made it eager to be consumed. The Bellamys, Eustace, and Corinne were never seen again. Some said they perished in the flames, a fitting end for the architects of so much misery. Others whispered that they had slipped away in the darkness just before the fire was set, taking their blood money with them and vanishing back into the chaos of the war from which they had emerged. Their ultimate fate remains one of the many unclosed loops in the story, a loose thread that history never quite managed to tie off. In the years that followed the war, the land where the inn had stood took on a life of its own, becoming a focal point for the region's folklore. It was a place to be avoided, a cautionary boundary on the mental map of the parish. When the parish surveyors formally redrew the county maps in the 1880s, they made a curious but deliberate change. The old trace road was officially rerouted, its new path making a wide, inefficient arc to the north, adding a full mile to the journey. The new road deliberately, and without any stated reason, avoided the line of the old culvert and the blighted ground where the inn's foundations lay. The land was left to the cypress trees in the bayou, and it began to develop its own legends. Rivermen, poling their skiffs through the backwaters of Bayou Masson, told stories of strange lights seen on moonless nights, too faint, yellow lanterns glowing through the mists where the gallery of cypress crossings once stood. They claimed you could sometimes hear the creak of an empty rocking chair, even when the air was dead still. After heavy spring floods, which were a regular feature of life on the Ouachita, children wading in the shallows downstream would occasionally find small, strange coins in the mud. They were the old meal tokens from the inn, washed out from their hiding places in the silt, small metal ghosts rising from a watery grave. The stories became a part of the local lexicon, a way of remembering what the official record had tried to forget. The bend in the road, the burned-out patch of land, became a warning passed down through generations. The descendants of those who had lived through the terror, the families of the men who had dug up the bodies, kept their children away from that part of the bayou. They knew, with a certainty that was bone deep, that the ground there was sour. In the lush, almost suffocating greenery of the Louisiana landscape, there were 3 distinct, bare patches of earth where the grass refused to grow. One marked the spot where the inn's front steps had been. The other 2, side by side, were where the cistern and the rain barrel had once stood. It was as if the soil itself was poisoned, unable to support life, holding the memory of the taint in its very chemistry. In the heat of a summer afternoon, the cicadas, which filled the air with their deafening, electric drone, would sometimes fall silent as one passed that spot, a sudden, unnerving quiet that felt like the landscape was holding its breath, listening for something. The story might have faded completely into the realm of unverifiable ghost tales were it not for the work of Dr. Marietta Qualls, a historian at Tulane University in the 1970s. Dr. Qualls specialized in the social history of the Civil War era, collecting oral histories and obscure documents that painted a picture of the conflict's impact on the small, forgotten corners of the South. She stumbled upon the case of Cypress Crossings through a series of letters written by Constable Sylvan Marchand to his brother, letters filled with his rage and frustration over the miscarriage of justice. Intrigued, Qualls began to dig, compiling every scrap of information she could find. The cursory court records, the parish maps, the newspaper articles about the fire. She even located and interviewed the elderly grandson of Obed Raines, the ferryman. The old man, his voice a reedy whisper, recounted the stories his grandfather had told him, of the fine goods he had bought from Eustace Bellamy for pennies on the dollar, goods that had clearly belonged to travelers who never made it to his ferry. But the most significant document Dr. Qualls uncovered was a letter, found pressed within an old family Bible that had belonged to a niece of Aunt Zora Duplessis. Zora had fled the parish immediately after the trial, disappearing to relatives in Texas. The letter, Written in a shaky but clear hand shortly before her death was her final confession, her attempt to cleanse her soul of the burden she had carried for so many years. In it, she described the metallic taste of the powder Corinne would have her add to the stew on certain nights. She detailed the chilling, methodical routine of the sickness and the disappearances. But the letter ended with a sentence that was both a plea for absolution and a final, chilling indictment. She wrote, "I cooked the meals, but I did not feed the bayou." The words drew a stark, terrifying line between the human evil she had been forced to serve and the older, more elemental hunger that the Bellamy's seemed to be satisfying. It was a distinction that spoke to the core question of Cypress Crossings. Was the curse that haunted that patch of land merely the product of human greed and wartime opportunism? Were the Bellamy's simply ruthless predators who had created a perfect killing machine and cloaked it in the guise of Southern hospitality? Or were they something more? Were they caretakers of something ancient and malevolent that resided in the dark waters and the sucking mud of the bayou, a hungry entity that had been there long before the inn was built and remained long after it had burned to ashes? Was the poison in the food, or was it in the land itself? And the Bellamy's were merely the priests who had learned to make the proper sacrifices. Dr. Qualls, in her final monograph on the subject, could not provide a definitive answer. She presented the evidence, the folklore, and the lingering scars on the landscape, leaving the final conclusion to the reader. The archives give us the facts, the bodies, the ledger, the corrupt magistrate. The earth gives us the rumors, the ghost lights, the barren soil, the unsettling silence. The story of Cypress Crossing serves as a grim reminder that some routes, though they may appear to be shortcuts, exact a toll far greater than time or money. They lead to places where the line between human cruelty and supernatural hunger becomes blurred, and where the question of whether the evil is in the people or in the place ceases to matter. The only certainty is that the bayou keeps what it is given, and its memory is long. The case file on Cypress Crossings is now closed. Thank you for walking these halls of history with us. If you are new here, for more, subscribe to the Blaspheme Archive to stand among those who will be present when the next case is opened, and leave a comment to share your thoughts on what you have witnessed.